I want to bring in John Micek, if I can, who is standing by as a U.S. political commentator. John, your read on this big story, and we're going to get to Paul Manafort because that's also happening today, but this one seems to be much bigger.
Yeah, Todd, good evening to you. There's no way to understate the impact of this guilty plea in the Southern District of New York by Michael Cohen, the president's longtime personal fixer. And the president, as you said a second ago, the president is not mentioned by name in court documents, but that's fairly standard. Federal prosecutors never mention somebody who's not being indicted or charged by name. They're usually listed as an unindicted co-conspirator. Based on what we know by public statements and public records and by inference, that this politician being named in the federal court papers appears to be President Donald Trump. If that's true, and if the president had knowledge that this payment was taking place in order to influence the election, that's tremendously bad news for the president. The question, of course, becomes, Todd, of whether the president can be charged while he's in office. There's some speculation it doesn't appear that's the case. And so impeachment could be the only avenue towards pursuing this. But that's very early days right now. Certainly, this is not something the president wants to hear. He's flying, even as we speak, to West Virginia for a campaign rally aboard Air Force One. I'm sure every television set on that jet is now tuned to news accounts of this. And it can't be a very pleasant place right now for President Trump.
Let me ask you what this could do politically to the president.
Again, it's early days. This is certainly not something that the president wanted to happen. This is probably the most consequential and impactful day in a presidency that has been consequential and impactful almost every day since the get-go. As you mentioned a moment ago, we have this Cohen thing happening. We have the guilty verdict against the president's former campaign chairman, Paul Manafort, happening at the same time. It's too early to say, of course, what this could portend for 2020, but this is something the president definitely does not need politically.
There's something else, too, for Michael Cohen. I mean, you were listening to prosecutors, John, coming to us live from Manhattan a few moments ago, in which they said these are very serious charges. Of course, Michael Cohen is a lawyer. He knew what he was doing was wrong. He's now pled guilty, saying, yes, I did these things with the intention of influencing a presidential election. It doesn't get much bigger than that. What is the next step for him here? By striking a plea deal, what could that potentially mean for Michael Cohen?
Well, I mean, what that means, Todd, most likely is that if he is not already cooperating with federal prosecutors, he will very shortly be cooperating with federal prosecutors. And that in and of itself is a long and complicated dance. He will have to provide information that can be corroborated, that is trustworthy. He will have to provide that information, one presumes, in future prosecutions, if there are any. And he does all that in the hope that he'll get some consideration from the judge at time of sentencing. He faces some significant jail time here, as does Mr. Manafort, and that is often the great incentive. What's really, I guess, not funny, funny, but ironic funny about this is that in Michael Cohen, you had a guy who said he would take a bullet for President Trump. But when you have the full weight of the federal judicial system weighing down upon you, the prospect of being separated from your family for multiple years, say 3 to 6 years in this case, that can change your mind awfully quickly. And that's clearly what happened in the case of Michael Cohen.
We were talking to a number of other commentators, John, as this news was breaking. And one of the things they were saying is, it's now clear that Michael Cohen is turning on the president. Would you agree?
I'm sorry, Todd, you broke up on me there. Could you repeat that, please?
That Michael Cohen is now, turning on the president, is now offering this information up in order to protect himself.
That certainly does seem that way, and that's that is now a great pressure point for the president. This is a guy who was in on everything, was in on real estate deals, knows about the payment to women. Goodness knows what they found in the documents and the hard drives in his office when they executed those search warrants. There is nobody who knows Donald Trump better. There's no one who is closer to Donald Trump and his personal affairs than is Michael Cohen. It's a very damaging day for the president.
You also mentioned, some of those hard drives and possible recordings. We know that Michael Cohen certainly had at least one recording that generated headlines not so long ago, and who knows what else there is out there. I want to ask you, if I can, as well, about Paul Manafort. We want to be clear, that is the lesser of the two stories in terms of its impact on the White House. But Paul Manafort found guilty on 8 counts today, 8 out of 18. This is a man who was the campaign chairman for Donald Trump for a period of about 3 months in the summer of 2016. 8 counts relating to a number of fraud charges. We want to be clear, remember, these crimes happened before he was ever in charge of the Trump campaign. So the only thing the Trump campaign could be guilty of, based on all this, is not doing proper vetting of Paul Manafort, which, of course, is not a crime. But the optics are not good, John.
No, they certainly are not, Todd. And keep in mind, this case now was being prosecuted in the Northern District of Virginia, several hundred miles away down the Acela corridor from New York City. But this was the first major test that Special Counsel Robert Mueller faced in his ongoing investigation of alleged Russian collusion with the Trump campaign during the Trump organization of the 2016 campaign. A defeat here would have been tremendously damaging, at least from an optics point of view, for the Mueller camp. And again, Mr. Manafort is somebody who could also potentially cooperate with federal prosecutors. We don't know what he knows, and there are stories certainly he could tell to try to obtain consideration at sentencing as well.
Let me ask you about the notion of a pardon, John, which the president himself has refused to confirm or deny, the idea of pardoning both of these people.
I would think, and I heard some speculation on this as I was prepping for this for our conversation, Todd, that the president really only has one pardon in his pocket right now. And if this was the pardon show being hosted by Donald Trump reality television star, Paul Manafort is currently in the pole position for any presidential pardon. Certainly, the president had been sending signals previous to this that Mr. Manafort could be in for a pardon if things did not go his way. He could be the more likely that is Mr. Cohen for any sort of presidential consideration.
What do you think the political strategy is going to be now for the White House?
I'm going to be sitting with popcorn tonight watching this rally in West Virginia that the president is holding for a Republican U.S. Senate candidate there. Those become sort of his primal scream moments where he rallies against the system, where he attacks his enemies, where he plays to the crowd. And what he says about these federal actions today, the verdict for Mr. Manafort and the plea for Michael Cohen, will speak volumes, I think, about the White House's mindset going forward. It would not be at all surprising to see President Trump to go on the attack, to try to further brand the Mueller probe as a witch hunt. He's in a slightly more difficult box with the plea for Mr. Cohen. If he is in fact this politician named in the federal court papers, it becomes a little bit more delicate for him for what he's going to say, because certainly prosecutors will be looking very closely at that.
All right, John Micek, U.S. political commentator, joining us from Pennsylvania with his take on these stories. Good to have you on, John. Thank you for making time for CTV again today.
Anytime. Talk soon.